Hello, my name is Debbie Kleiner, and this is a session on emotional resilience being run by MHFAE England and Thrive London. So this is really designed as a course that can be more beneficial to those who have already attended a Mental Health First Aid England course. But what we're going to cover is we're going to look at what emotional resilience means, but we're also looking at its connection to mental health. But we want to also explore this understanding of your own emotional resilience, as well as looking at the factors that are involved and that build emotional resilience. And finally, we're going to use this information to support people with poor mental health. So if you have attended a mental health first aid course, you may remember looking in quite depth at what that term mental health actually means. And the key thing here to explain is that it's about how you feel, think, and behave. And this is important because as we go through the session today on emotional resilience, we will be touching on elements to do with resilience that relate to feelings, to thoughts, and to behavior. You may also remember learning about the stress container, and we're going to look in a bit more depth about how the stress container links to resilience. But just to briefly recap on the stress container approach, really what that means when I say container is that we all have some sort of container. Whatever shape yours is, you're going to see that we depict that as a sort of a triangle, but we all have a different shape container, a different size container. There's no right or wrong. The thing is that we all have stress pouring into our container, and all of our stressors are going to be very individual and very different. But if we don't address our stress, then when our container gets full, it's going to start overflowing. And you might notice that you have some signs when things are becoming too much and things start to overflow. And if we don't turn on or learn to turn on our tap, which empties our container by engaging in helpful coping strategies, then we're going to be living in that feeling of having our stress response on or our alarm reaction on. So we will learn that resilience really supports our ability to not only process the stress that's in our container, but even sometimes to protect us from stress coming into our container. You would have also learned that we all have coping strategies. Sometimes we have what we would call unhelpful coping strategies, and they could be things like not talking or turning to drugs and alcohol. But coping strategies that are helpful will be things, for example, we're all different, but for example, like taking the dog for a walk or doing some yoga or just stopping and relaxing. And then finally, you would have learned that there are some protective factors, some things that make us feel better. And I suppose this is where resilience comes into play, because resilience is a protective factor. And the things that you do to build your resilience are things that are going to protect you from poor mental health or from the experience that you have of too much stress. And then the final element that I want to recap, if you've attended an MHFAE England course, is this acronym ALGE. You'll know what that means if you've attended a course, but just to briefly go over this, the A stands for approach. So this is where you've noticed somebody is not quite themselves, perhaps they have poor mental health, and you approach them and you ask them how they are. You assess what's going on for them, and then you assist them if there's any crisis, such as suicidal crisis, for example, or even a panic attack. But then the L stands for listen non-judgmentally. The G stands for give support and information, and both of the E's stand for encourage. The first D is about encouraging professional help, and the second D is about encouraging other support. So we're going to really build on the other support element, because as well as professional help, somebody can work on their own resilience. So we're going to move to exploring, what does that even mean? So perhaps think about your own definition. What pops into your mind when you hear that word resilience? Now, it does come from the Latin word resilio, and that means bounce back. So just reflect on what this means to you, because just like the definition of mental health, there are many, many definitions of emotional resilience. But let me give you a definition, which I quite like, because it refers to this ability to bounce back. But we're talking emotional resilience here. So it's that bounce back from negative emotional experiences by flexible adaptation to the changing demands of stressful experiences. But I've actually given you a second definition, because this one talks about it as being an art of living. An art of living that's entwined with self-belief, self-compassion, and enhanced cognition. It's the way through which we empower ourselves to perceive adversities as temporary and keep evolving through the pain and suffering. Now, I've underlined self-compassion because probably the most important skill really is that skill of self-compassion and self-acceptance. So you're starting to understand that resilience involves really being aware of our inner potentials. The only thing that differentiates an emotionally resilient and an emotionally fragile person is the way the former chooses to respond. What it doesn't mean is it doesn't mean that stress won't affect us or that losses won't make us feel low. It only implies that we have that vision to stand up and carry on despite that adversity. So I just want to cover some key facts about emotional resilience. Now, life is a roller coaster of emotions. Some of us cope better, some of us seem calm and seem to effortlessly deal with life's challenges. And those are the people that we might want to emulate. Why do they seem to be so wise? Why do they seem to have that emotional capacity to deal with the difficulties of life? But it's not a gift handed down to the lucky few, and it's not a personality trait. Now, there are, of course, elements that are personality traits that will improve somebody's resilience. But emotional resilience per se is not a personality trait. Now, we can all take steps to achieve it. It's not a gift given to a sort of certain type of person. But the key really lies in three areas. And there's a great book, which I shall refer to at the end, by Dr. Harry Barry, called Emotional Resilience. And he says that the key lies in those three skills: personal, social, and life skills. And that's what we're going to focus on. But there's also somebody that you could look up called Dr. Lucy Hone, who says that resilience requires ordinary magic. So we all have the ability to build it over time. We all know that it can be eroded as well by difficult experiences. Now, what it does require is honesty about our own strengths and our own weaknesses. And this is where the self-awareness comes in. But a lot of the skills we're going to talk about today are, you'll notice, very intertwined. They are interdependent. One comes with another, but there are some subtle differences. Humor is quite important as well. When you're exploring your own self, when you're looking at your strengths and your weaknesses, and when you're trying some of the techniques that we are going to refer to today, having a sense of curiosity and, of course, humor is key. But the most important thing, as I said earlier, is self-compassion, but also self-acceptance. Unconditional self-acceptance is absolutely key. So I want you to now think about a person that is emotionally resilient. And this person is somebody that maybe you know, and I want you just to perhaps pause and write down the factors that make your resilient person resilient. And I'm going to show you just some examples of my resilient person. Okay, and I just want to also make the link here between the protective factors that you would have learned about on your MHFAE England course and these factors that I'm referring to here. So, the science of resilience tells us there are many factors that contribute to a person's resilience, and they are sometimes referred to as protective factors. And there's lots and lots of studies that are really helping us identify what are these critical elements that enable resilience. But I've actually just put it into 3 areas here. And the first area is the social element. And this is where somebody, knows how to engage in conversation. They know how to read those nonverbal cues. And then there are physical elements, looking after yourself and being able to laugh. Those are just some examples of the sorts of things I'm talking about. Of course, there are many, many others. And then there's the mental elements, which include a lot of the things I've mentioned already, like self-compassion, but things like accepting uncertainty. We have to, as humans, live with uncertainty and discomfort. And when we fight against that, that can make us feel not particularly resilient, but also having those skills of being assertive, being able to know when to say no, and also being able to sort of believe in yourself, being kind to yourself, being able to control your emotions, and having confidence. So these are the 3 core elements that we're looking at here, and a little bit more of a summary of what this is all about. So we sometimes call the mental elements psychological elements, and really what I'm going to focus on today is really that sort of mental or psychological side of things. But we could also actually refer to what I call psychosocial, because the psychological elements and the social elements kind of combine as well. So a bit like that definition of health, which is that sort of balance between physical, mental, and social, these are the 3 core pillars that we can actually work on to improve our emotional resilience, or even those 3 dimensions of emotional resilience. So we're going to go to this into this in a little bit more depth, but I first want to introduce to you something that you would have learned about on a mental health first aid course, and this is the continuum. Now, you may remember that the horizontal axis on this continuum is referring to a diagnosis of an illness on the right-hand side, or on the left-hand side, or no diagnosis on the right-hand side. Now, when we're looking at the vertical axis, here we're looking at how do I feel? Do I have good mental health? Do I have bad mental health? And really what we want to explore here is how resilience affects somebody's mental health. So if you think about the person that is in the bottom right, so that's a person with no diagnosed mental illness and who has poor mental health. If they are resilient, then they are going to bounce back up more quickly. And if you think about the person in the bottom left, that is somebody who has a diagnosis, again, the more resilient they are, the more they are likely to recover quickly. So resilience supports recovery. Resilience is what keeps people at the top of the continuum. But hard work is required to stay resilient. And just like recovery, it takes time, it takes commitment, and it takes effort. I'm now going to play you a video, which is by somebody called Asher Phillips. And the video is really going to teach us about how somebody stays resilient despite quite difficult adversity. So as you watch this, perhaps consider a couple of questions. Do you feel that you have to be broken to be fixed again? And also, what do you think about that term, mental toughness?
People say you have to be broken to be fixed again. My name is Asha Phillip, and I run. Athletics, for me, was just a bit of fun. It was something different and it was something new. Trampolining was my main sport and I loved it. And then I fell into double mini trampolining and then I became a world junior champion at it. I was at the World Championships in Quebec. I bounced up, but when I came down, I didn't land right. I could just hear the crunch. I could just see my leg pointing in a different direction. And I just remember grabbing my leg and then just screaming and screaming. There was nothing holding my legs together. In a heartbeat, everything was just gone. Everything I worked hard for had vanished. Everyone told me I was a write-off. So how does a child of age of 17 get back up? It felt like I'd lost something. I'd lost a part of me. I wanted to give up. And when you're at that point of just giving up, that's when you're meant to really turn your life around and change. It was my mum who believed in me. And for that, I believed in her. I really do question how I made it out. It was little by little, coming in to do the rehab. Step by step, you started to see improvement. The crutches went away, then I could walk. I was able to jog and then run. But then I had loads of injuries along the way. The only thing standing between success and failure is mental toughness. It's about being resilient. Being an athlete isn't like a normal job. The gym, strengthening, the mind work, the fitness for one shot, for 11 seconds. There are a lot of knockbacks, a lot. It's how you handle it. But it's also the most amazing release. I let out all my stresses, all my bad energy. Every time I show up to train, I have the opportunity to learn more about myself and how to run correctly. Some people train brilliantly, but in a race, they don't win. You need focus. You're in an arena of thousands of people, then you're on the start line with 7 other women, then you have a man holding a gun, and you have to learn to channel all this, not panic. But there's so much going on with your family in the crowd, everyone's screaming, wanting you to do well, and obviously they're screaming for the girls alongside you. How do you put that all aside and say, okay, I have to focus on myself, focus on my lane, focus on me. There are sacrifices. There are lots of ways to have fun. Go after your goals and balance it out the right way. In the end, it's about knowing what's important to you and what makes you thrive. That's not just athletics, that's life.
Okay, so we learned there that for Asha, what helped her was her family, but she also talks about that little by little. And there's a Japanese term called kaizen, Kaizen. And that's about little by little and not trying to have goals that are not realistic. So she talks about focus, about balance, about knowing what's important to you and what makes you thrive. And she also talks about enjoying keeping learning. So that term mental toughness, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to have this armor, does it? Resilience. But for her, that's how she describes it. But toughness, it implies something perhaps different to how you consider resilience is. So I would now like to invite you to explore your own resilience. And this is a questionnaire that you can do if you are interested in taking the test. So obviously just press pause. The way this works is that you answer these 12 questions and you basically score yourself for each between 1 and 5, where 5 is strongly agree and 1 is strongly disagree. So just be honest with yourself. There are other tests that you can do. You may have heard of positive psychologist Martin Seligman, and there is something called the VIA test, which is on the Authentic Happiness website. That is a survey of character strengths, which is much more detailed than this. But this I thought was quite a useful sort of idea of how resilient you are. And you might notice that the first sort of 7 questions or so are about thinking, and the last questions are more about sort of behaviour. So the results are here. Please don't panic if you have a low score. It really doesn't matter. This is just to give you an idea of understanding, where you are and what aspects you can work on. But the message really here is that it's really useful to understand your own resilience and understand the factors that might improve it in order to practice mental health first aid. So just like when we taught you about mental health, looking after your own mental health is important, and making sure that you have the toolkits that to support your own mental health, just as we taught you that's important in supporting other people, it's also important to consider your resilience. So something that Dr. Radar did on the Thrive London video about emotional resilience, the slightly shorter one that is also on the Thrive London website, I wanted to reflect what she did on that video and ask you and invite you at the end of the session to consider these 3 questions. Resilience to me means, and hopefully you'll have the answer towards the end of the session if you don't have the answer now. The second question is, what daily tool do you use to build resilience? And the third one is, when are you resilient? So I am resilient when I. So we'll come back to this towards the end of the session. But now I want to talk to you about stress again. So I mentioned the stress container, and I reminded you that we all have a stress container that stress pours into. And when the container gets full up, things start to overflow. And then, of course, we have coping strategies that turn the tap on and empty the container, and the helpful ones are those that do that. But what I'm introducing you to here are some skills. And as I mentioned earlier, there are life skills, social skills, and personal skills. And what these do is they help us process stress, but they also act as a sort of protector. So they're protective factors. So perhaps as you're looking at these skills, you can privately reflect on which ones you could improve. And what we're going to focus on this session is more of the sort of personal skills. Now, if you want to look at this in a bit more depth, I'd invite you to look at the book by Dr. Harry Barry called Emotional Resilience, and he gives techniques for each one of these areas that can help you improve these skills. For example, if you find it difficult to deal with uncertainty, when I said earlier you need a sense of humour, if you look at the activity in the book about uncertainty, what Dr. Harry Barry invites you to do is to live for a month with uncertainty at the sort of effectively the toss of a coin, kind of exposure therapy, if you like. So some of these do require a bit of a sense of humour, but let's just have a look at some of these skills. Now, really what's required with these skills is very much self-awareness. So how often do you sort of hit that pause button just for a second and ask yourself, what's going on internally? And how often do you actually notice your thoughts? And not only notice your thoughts, but actually reflect on, are they helping me in any particular situation? Because another part of self-awareness is about tracking your emotions. So in any moment of time, can you consider, what am I feeling right now? And another part of self-awareness is not just tracking your thoughts and emotions, but it's also about tracking your reactions. So what are you doing in a particular situation? Are your reactions, is the way you're behaving helping you, or is it actually harming you? But another part, really, of self-awareness is physiology. Some of us are very attuned to our thinking and maybe even our reactions, but we are not always so good at knowing what's actually going on in our bodies. We're not aware of our breath or our heart rate, and that's how we can understand how a bit more about how we feel. It's important because physiology can affect our resilience. Now, another part of self-awareness is, of course, knowing your strengths. So being very deeply aware of what you're good at and your other strengths, and also how to use those strengths to overcome adversity, to overcome challenges. But it's also important to be aware of your weaknesses and how you can correct those weaknesses. Now, self-regulation is really key because that includes emotional control, that includes emotional awareness, and your ability not just to notice your thoughts and your reactions, but to sort of understand whether or not you are too geared up, for example. If you are too revved up, then your fight or flight response is engaged, your alarm reaction is on, and you're prepared for a battle. But maybe there isn't a battle. So, to stay resilient or to enable resilience in a particular moment, you're going to need to have some skills up your sleeve to regulate that, to decide, I need to calm my physiology down. And something else that sort of comes alongside this self-regulation is having the ability to set goals. We know it takes a lot of self-regulation and control to reach your goals. But we know that having goals, having a future focus is really important because it gives us something to aim for. So let's just share my slides again with you a moment. So I want to now invite you to consider an activity. You can press pause. You can set a timer on your phone. It only takes 1 minute to connect with yourself. Now, of course, if you've never tried mindfulness, you might have a view that you don't have time, that, half an hour a day is too much, and perhaps that is the case, but see how you feel after just a minute of this. So your mission is simply to count your breaths during 60 seconds. You don't need to try and stop your thoughts. Just let them pass. Don't dwell on them. Just focus on your breaths. So each in and out is one breath. So after a minute, how many breaths did you take? And did you actually notice a difference? When I've done this with the live group that I ran this session with, most people said they felt much calmer even just after that 1 minute of connecting with themselves. So one key to resilience is practicing self-awareness by practicing mindfulness and taking that time to calm yourself as well and making sure that your alarm reaction is off. But the other thing that I want to invite you to consider is emotional control. So let's just focus a little bit on emotions and try to understand, what are we dealing with here? Ask yourself, how do I feel right now? And this is an example of an emotions wheel. You'll find lots of different variations of the emotions wheel that was used, in couples therapy. American psychologists came up with this. Dr. Robert Plutchik is one who proposed that there are 8 primary emotions that serve as the foundation for all others. So things like joy, sadness, acceptance, disgust. So this is just illustrative of what we call the emotions wheel. So this is not, as I said, just about being tough or having an armor or having a shield. It's about experiencing a setback, which inevitably creates this emotional reaction, and it's allowing yourself to experience that, but knowing how to switch it off. And with so many emotions, how can we navigate those turbulent waters without getting lost, those turbulent waters of feelings. So I'm reluctant to use the word positive emotion or negative emotion. It's about the potential energy created behind that emotion. And it's normal to experience many and all of these emotions, but how we then choose to behave because of them and how we regulate them is what matters when it comes to resilience. If we can't switch them off, they can overwhelm us, which can lead to anxiety. So this is really about deciding how you're going to react to your emotion. So let's just look a little bit deeper at the brain for a moment here. So I want us to consider what's going on with our awareness. Now, we all have the prefrontal cortex, which is represented here by the red area. And these help us reflect on our decisions as to what we do with our emotions. And we all have free will about how we respond. Now, in the area towards the back of the brain is an area called the hippocampus, and that can trigger fear in an area called the amygdala, which is around the center of our brain, a very small area, but it is what initiates that sort of emotional reaction. And the links between that sort of central area, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex, it can be strengthened, which helps us build our resilience and therefore regulate how we respond. And by practicing mindfulness, that strengthens those links between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And then when we think about the teenage brain, how does the teenage brain react to stress? Well, they're more sensitive to the stress hormone cortisol and perhaps will feel its effects faster. And also, the prefrontal cortex is less developed in adolescence, so stress may be experienced for longer periods. So we know we can control our emotional response by engaging our thought processes in a way that can be more helpful to us. So here's some examples of survival behavior. And this is really about reflecting, am I choosing to behave in the way that is helpful? So this is an example. There is a threat. There is a wild tiger in front of you, for example. Your thoughts are danger. You react with fear and you behave by escaping. Now, the function of that behavior is useful to you because you might be about to be attacked. But when we think about a threat that is a perceived threat, for example, your perceived threat might be, how am I going to pay the mortgage? Your thoughts might be the same, danger. Your reaction might be fear. But now this is where we need to make those links between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex do their work, because we don't need to escape. The function of escaping is not going to be safety in that particular scenario. So we need to choose a behavior that is more useful. For example, addressing your stress and working out ways that you can tackle these perceived threats. So in summary, we need to choose our reaction to our feeling and our thought. Now, you will have learned about thinking distortions on the MHFAE course if you've attended one, but I've just got 5 common thinking distortions here that I want to show you. So just to explain what we mean by some of these, for example, personalization is where you take things that have happened or comments that have been made too personally. All or nothing or black and white thinking is where you think things are right or wrong because something's gone wrong on one occasion. Perhaps it's always going to go wrong. And catastrophizing, that's where you think of the worst possible scenario. Now, here's some examples. You've probably got your own examples. So perhaps think of something where something that's happened to you, an event that's happened recently. And for each of these thinking traps, generate some thoughts that illustrate each of the thinking traps for that scenario. For example, you have a fight with your significant other. With a thinking distortion or a thinking trap, mind reading might be that you assume you know what your significant other is about to say, which is not always very helpful in an argument. Personalizing might be that they've said something to you once before, and you assume in this particular fight that they're going to say the same thing again because they've said it to you once before. Or catastrophizing, your relationship is going to end. This is it. I have to leave. And then out you walk, and that doesn't help because you're not addressing the argument. So every time you have a scenario where you are thinking in a way that's unhelpful to you, stop and think, even if it's reflecting afterwards, how can I have dealt with that differently? Perhaps I didn't need to jump to conclusions. Perhaps I didn't need to think of the worst possible scenario. Perhaps I didn't need to choose to have that mental filter where I focused on all of the negatives rather than all of the positives. Now, of course, working through something like this can be done in therapy, but you don't need to be in therapy in order to help yourself think in a way that is more helpful to you. And this, of course, improves your resilience. Now, this is something that can be useful when working with young people, but extremely useful for you to do yourself. So spend some time thinking about what's in your stress container and start to put things into these categories. Sometimes you can do this where you have just two circles, with the inside circle being things I can control and the outside circle being things I can't control. So perhaps get a cup, trace around it, and even take one particular scenario and start to think about that. So here's an example that I've given you here where the person has written the thing they have control over the most is allowing themselves to have 8 hours sleep, moving their body regularly, reaching out to friends. The things they have no control over is whether or not everyone else wears a mask or washes their hands. This is obviously COVID related. So people who are resilient do think of stressors as challenges. And we know that optimism is critical in resilience. If you think about resilience as a kind of marathon, being able to stay on that track and continuing to work to overcome any challenges that you face along the way. And optimism might really be considered to be that engine that is required to keep that resilience running. It's giving us that attitude to carry on persisting. But the other thing is that part of optimism is very much being able to separate out what you can and can't control in any situation. And accepting some aspects of a situation is really important. So acceptance is a key skill. And something that resilient people do very well is they don't think about stresses as threats, but challenges. So when there's a problem in front of them, they have that mindset to think, yep, I can overcome this, versus this is a threat, I'm going to withdraw and I'm going to run away. So what I'd like to invite you to do is to put optimism into practice in a situation that is important to you. So try and use this technique to address that. I also want you to not only list out all of the aspects you can control, but I want you to just go a little bit further and challenge yourself to identify even more aspects that you can control. Because if you sit with something for a bit longer, you might find that you have actually quite a long list of things that you can control. And that's what an optimist does. They focus on what they can control and they will let go of what they can't. So I'd also like to invite you to think about spotting optimism. So when you see optimism in yourself, notice that behavior in yourself. When you see optimism in other people, in your children, in your colleagues, without sounding patronizing to colleagues, call it out, point out that behavior. especially with children, then your child knows that that behavior is one that's going to serve them in their resilience. And if you're an employer, when you see optimism in people that work for you, just don't let them go unnoticed. Recognize that behavior, because by praising that behavior, you're going to get more of that behavior, which is going to lead to happier and healthier people in the long run. Okay, so let's now move on to think about ways that you can actually help people when it comes to mental health first aid. What I want to do, though, first is just summarize what I've said already. And I want to summarize by explaining that a lot of what I've talked about is that word confidence, without calling it that, but a lot of this does take confidence, being willing to take risks and admitting mistakes. Confidence is doing the right thing despite opposition, and being willing to do these things, admitting mistakes and accepting praise graciously. It's not easy though, but it is achievable. But resilient people are confident that they will succeed despite any setbacks that they will experience. They have the self-belief to take those risks, and failure is just another step towards success. But one simple way to improve your resilience is to reframe. And I've mentioned Martin Seligman, the positive psychologist. He says that the way that we explain setbacks to ourselves is key. And you may remember the ABC technique that we taught you on the MHFAE England course. But the ABC technique is about thought awareness and cognitive restructuring. Because when you fear the future, when you put yourself down, when you criticize yourself, when you expect failure, you're thinking negatively, and you might not realize that. So thought awareness is where you observe your thinking patterns and you're aware of this negativity, and then you can reframe it. You can pick yourself up after that setback and make sure that you do reframe those thoughts. So this approach, the ABC technique, is about an activating event or a trigger. So that trigger might be somebody that is a friend of yours, you wave at them across the road and they don't wave back. Your beliefs could be that, oh, they don't like me very much. The consequences could be then that you don't bother phoning them anymore because you think they don't want to be your friend. But by disputing this, by adding a D to the ABC, by disputing this and saying to yourself, what evidence, this is the E, what evidence do I have for my beliefs? By challenging your beliefs, you might come up with some alternative answers. For example, you might realize that they may not have their contact lenses in. They may be bereaved. Something may have happened to them. We don't know what's happened. Are they okay, actually? So you can reframe the situation. The other thing that's key is being adaptable for building resilience, because strength rarely comes from inflexibility. And adaptability is really understanding your failures, reflecting on them, and being open to new ideas and finding ways to complete something difficult rather than giving up. And learning to be adaptable means trying to identify and deal with any self-sabotage. Managing stress is key as well. So addressing your stress, it's an important part of becoming more adaptable. When you're relaxed, you're much more able to withstand your setbacks and focus much more clearly. You're also much less likely to lose your cool when things don't work out. So keeping stress in check starts with how you look after yourself inside and outside of work. So make sure that you sleep well, roughly 7 to 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep is ideal. Try to keep to a good routine and just add regular exercise to your schedule. So the final, sort of in summary, the final element before I move on to look at how you can help other people is understanding that connections are one of the 5 ways to well-being, if you remember that from your MHFA course. Now, the 5 ways to well-being, you can Google it. It's an evidence-based framework. Connections is key, and a really critical thing is having people in your life, maybe just one person even. Somebody that you know you can rely on, no matter where they are in the world, where that relationship is robust, they think well of you, and you can rely on them for support when things get tough. So it's also your relationships that are important in predicting resilience. It's not just the connection at the level of interpersonal relationships. Another aspect that seems important is what I would loosely describe as spirituality. So that's feeling attached to or connected to something that is larger than yourself. Now, that may not be faith. It might be a deep connection to nature. It might be a sense of spirituality that you get when you're out walking through a forest. So that attachment could be to something that is a mission even, or a purpose, to an idea, something that you believe is worth fighting for. So I want to invite you to consider this connections wheel. And this is where you can consider your key relationships. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you with your immediate family, with your extended family, your friends, your colleagues? You can just draw a circle, make a trivial pursuit cheese, where you've got 8 sort of areas. You've split your triangle into 8. And on a scale of 0 to 10, just rate every connection that you feel in each should be in each section. We've also got in there daily interactions with strangers, which are key, your wider community, your colleagues. And what needs to change? Is there any action you can take? So press pause and complete this activity if you're interested in self-reflecting on your connections. So now let's move on to your role as a mental health first aider. So first of all, let's consider the person's resilience zones. The reference here is PSI Online, actually, if you want to read the really great blogs about this. So survival, that's how we respond to adversity. Adapting is how we adjust to change. Recovering, that's how we bounce back. And thriving is how we then grow and become more resilient after adversity. So let's think about COVID, the most recent threat that all of us have experienced. Probably we're all past the survival stage, I would hope, and we've learned to adapt to our new world. But maybe it's too early to assume that people have recovered to the same level of happiness they had prior to COVID coming along and into our lives. But feeling stuck in the adapt stage could lead to quite long-term effects of poor mental health, and it's not a good place to be for too long. So back to Martin Seligman, the father of positive psychology. He discovered that there are broadly 3 types of responses to long-term adversity. And about a third of people will recover to where they were prior to their setback. And a third will even thrive and grow, but the other third will not recover easily. So where is the person that you're supporting in terms of their own mental health? So this is a feature that you can consider in more depth by looking at these questions. So again, pause if you want to look at some of these questions that you could ask people that you are supporting. Ask if they have a particular difficulty with one of these 4 stages. So finally, your role as a mental health first aider, helping them to reflect on whether they're stressed and of course listening to their feelings. But you can visit the Mind website, look at the dealing with pressure section, and you can help them identify their triggers and address stress. So there's some great tips on the Mind website and on the MHFA website under the Address Your Stress page. but you can help them think about what do they do to relax and encourage them to connect with their emotions, encourage them to practice self-awareness, which is what we've looked at here today on this session. And of course, as always, encourage them to seek professional help. But do remember to look after yourself, because you need to make sure that you take a step back and look at your own well-being, and make sure that you're calm and relaxed as well if you're able to help somebody else. So what about an action plan? Now, on the Thrive website, there's a link to the Mind Toolkit. The Mind Toolkit doesn't follow the same pillars that I've looked at here today, but it includes generally looking after your well-being, but it overlaps with the areas that I've looked at. It talks about making lifestyle changes and using relaxation techniques, and also developing your hobbies and interests, but also using some tools like the assertiveness tool, which you will find a link to on the website. And then my tips I've added here are practicing self-awareness, making that link between thoughts and feelings, and trying to learn to regulate emotion, but also choose which audit you're going to do, but do a life and personal skills audit and try and work out what you can improve. Learn to manage stress as well. So here's some useful resources for you. Of course, press pause if you want to make a note of these, and I've included some here for young people as well. And I've put a link there to the Mind Action Plan. And there's also Shout and Samaritans. So what are your answers to these questions? Press pause and try and answer these. But for me, resilience means not catastrophizing with bad news and just dealing with it in my stride. And one daily tool I use is taking moments to gather my thoughts. And I'm resilient when I know when to say no and when I practice self-care. So here's your reading list. And again, feel free to press pause and make a note of some of these wonderful books. The one I've mentioned the most is the one by Dr. Harry Barry. So thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed this workshop, and please visit the Thrive London website for more information.